Hey everyone, it's Alan Shimel, DevOps.com, and you're listening to another DevOps webinar. Thanks for joining us. We have a good webinar today lined up for both our DevOps.com and Security Boulevard audience. I think you're going to find this one really interesting. It's sponsored by our friends Veracode, part of CA Technologies, and it's entitled DevSecOps, Make Shift Happen. It's with my good friend. He's also a DevOps editor here, DevOps.com editor, Pete Chestna, Director of Developer Engagement. Pete, welcome.
Thanks, Alan.
Hey, before we jump in, Pete, I just want to let people know, well, I want to let them know that first of all, it's going to be a great webinar with a very interesting topic that Pete and I have spoken about before. But we've left some time for your questions, and nothing makes us happier than to have a great interactive webinar. So if you know, we do use the GoToWebinar control panel system or the GoToWebinar system. And if you look, I don't know why we're getting mail coming in here. If you look, you will see a section marked questions. And if you hit the little arrow or caret, it'll expand and you can see you can put your questions in there in real time. I highly advise you to do so. Don't wait till the end to start typing your question in. It's part of the mad rush. Come in early, get your question in there as it pops in your mind, and let's go on from there. Also, we'll be asking some poll questions during this webinar. Again, interactivity makes these webinars much better. They're multiple choice, easy questions. Take a moment, answer the poll questions when they pop up. It helps us make this better for you. So please do that. That being said, Pete, are we ready to rock and roll on this?
I'm ready, sir.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, but as usual, I'm going to take it as my moderator's privilege to jump in here where I think I could add some value.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, so just a quick second about me. I'm a longtime developer. That's where I came from. That's my passion. I love it to death. My experience in the most recent past is in application security. I am also very passionate about that aspect of my career. I've been at Veracode since 2006, so I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of different AppSec programs. I've taken, as a practitioner, my company from Waterfall to Agile to DevOps. We've moved from monolith to microservice. I consult with some of the biggest companies in the world, not only on AppSec, but also on their DevOps practices and certainly DevSecOps. So the interesting thing about applications and software is how it's enabling business. If you think about on the far right here, Airbnb, they don't own any property, and yet they have a $30 billion valuation. You think about Uber. Uber doesn't own a taxi. They don't have typical employees, and yet they're a multi-billion-dollar business. The way that we connect with consumers today, from a company to consumers to make value, is now driven largely by software. Of course, the problem with that is that the applications are insecure. We don't build them with security in mind. And certainly that's the way we've been doing it from day one. There are very few companies that have for more than 5 years paid attention to application security. Most of the exploits and the breaches are coming through that application layer. And it's not only because the applications are insecure, but it's because companies have done such a good job of building up the rest of their infrastructure, about putting up those perimeter walls that you hear about with intrusion protection and detection and firewalls and those kind of things. So this is the easy target. And as long as it remains the easy target, this is where the breachers are going to come in, because if you put a steel door up on your house but leave all your windows open, they'll just come in through the window. They don't need to go in through the hardened area. And of course, if we look at the breaches, they grow larger every time. The cost, not only to the companies but to the public, is growing as well. You take a look at the one on the far right, Equifax. Half of America's data was part of that breach, including mine and my wife's. And the aggravating thing is, this particular breach was very easy to prevent, and yet it wasn't. If we take a look and think about how software methodologies have changed through time, again, when I started over 25 years ago, we were doing Waterfall. And you think about what that means in the kind of silos that are built up around that. Very slow, plodding releases you can do in the early days, like one or less than one a year, with very, very large teams. And those are incredibly hard to manage. They were over budget. They were, past due all the time. When people started their Agile revolution, now we're moving into this phase where we can do one or two releases a year. Now, the thing that I'll point out to our listeners is, as you move between these methodologies, your biggest cost and the biggest barrier to you moving is not only culture, but it's the level of automation that you have. It's being able to quickly test the product to move it between these phases and move it closer and closer to your customer. If we take a look at how we got here, so here's your typical waterfall with your silos. Each of these at the top here would have a VP associated with them in a typical organization, and you hand off between them. And the problem with that is that the second that it leaves the silo where it originated from, you lose some fidelity. So from the planning stage to development, there's a little loss of information because we're playing telephone. And then it goes on to QA, security, operations. By the time it gets to operations, they don't know why you built it because they weren't in the room talking about it. They don't know who it was built for or how it's supposed to work. And the how it's supposed to work also loses fidelity as we move from development down towards operations. Developers make changes as they go. We hit something that we don't understand, or that's something that's very difficult. We have to change our approach, and those changes don't necessarily get reflected in documentation that operations gets to see. So what they get is a dumpster fire, and they figure out ways to make your application work in the production environment that they run it in. And the problem there is that information never flows upstream. Developers never get better at developing this stuff because they don't know the problems that occur. Both of these teams are extremely busy, and they don't have time to talk to each other in this particular model. When we move to Agile, the first thing that we would typically do is knock down those first two barriers. We put Dev and QA in the room with the planners, and we say, okay, now you can't say you're done, because in the previous world, development says, I'm done when I'm done coding. Done coding, throw it over the wall, it's quality's problem. Because they're now both in the room, they talk to each other, and the expectation is that the software has to function before you can say it's finished. It was a complete shift in the expectations on developers, which is an incredibly important point as we move to DevOps. The fact that developers now walk into a company with the expectation of themselves and from their company that the software that they write is of functional quality is a change from what it was 20, 25 years ago. So now we get some stronger continuity on business intent and also application knowledge, but that same problem exists in both directions, where operations doesn't understand the shortcuts, and the developers don't understand how it behaves in the actual production environment because they're not allowed to do that. DevOps, if it's done the way that it's intended, which is I get the full feedback. I have a fully cross-functional team that builds the software and runs the software. So at Amazon, you write it, you run it. So what you get in those cases is full continuity. When something doesn't work, it's your job to fix it. And when you go and talk about the next thing that you're going to do, all of the stakeholders are in the room. So operations or people with operational specialties can talk to the other people and say, hey, we did something like this before, and here's what happened, and we need to avoid this. So those voices in the room help you build those feedback loops so that you understand in a better way how to build the software. From a technology point of view, because of the economics, you're releasing once a year. If you do a task, it takes a whole day. It's painful, but to automate that might take 5 days, in which case I won't even see the benefit of that 5 days worth of work for 5 years. No company is going to invest in that kind of a payback. And the software changes so much that those tests might not even be reasonable. That automation might not work anymore. You might have to do more work on it, so it might be a greater than 5-year payout. When you get to Agile, if you're doing this thing once or twice a month, you have to put machinery in place. There is no way that you can release software at that speed safely to your consumer if you don't have some process and automation put into place. And of course, by the time you get to DevOps, because we want to be able to, in the very extreme cases, as you listen to Gene Kim, single piece flow. And that goes back to the Toyota production system. If I can take one developer's work and ship it to my customer, that means it doesn't sit on the shelf collecting dust. I can immediately get value out of it. To do that, you must have a strong foundation in automation. So that takes me to our first poll question. So, Alan, take it away.
Great. Okay. Where are you on your DevOps journey? And we've got 4 categories here. 1 is kind of still informing. 2 is probably even a little bit more than that, just forming. Storming, norming, or performing. Some interesting takes on that, but you can figure it out. If you can give us a moment once you figure out which are which, and fill it in. Come on, we need more of you to vote than that. Let's get at least half of the people here. We'll end voting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And what do our votes say?
I actually don't see the poll results here.
It's up. It's up now, Pete.
Okay.
We've got 50% of them are forming.
Okay. So they're in the beginning stages, essentially.
18% performing and 18% informing. So a little dumbbell effect on the ends there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Interesting. Well, what did you think about it, Pete?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised. I'm surprised at how many people are in that performing stage. So, the thought that they've gotten to the point where they've built the DevOps teams and they're doing a really good job at that. That's great news. It's great to see. And it kind of points to all the surveys you've seen over the last year are pointing in that direction. More and more people are doing it, and they're getting into really getting the value out of DevOps.
Yep. Agreed.
So Al,
Right.
while I got you on the line, let's talk about application security for a second. And this is some of my most recent thinking in this area about what the real goal of an application security program should be. And can you tell me a little bit about what people have typically thought about the value or the goal of their application security program?
Well, Pete, I think we've seen what people consider the goals and the value in their AppSec program sort of morph over the years because I'm old. And so when we first started talking about AppSec, Pete, I think a lot of the emphasis was on that traditional, taking that moat and castle type of model and just converting it to web-based apps, which for the most part meant throwing a WAF or something like that in front of your app. And the idea here was, try to detect malicious activity and basically filter it out at the firewall, right? Going both ways. But over time, we've seen AppSec shift left and become more about, hey, what's going on with your code? How is your application written? Was it fully tested prior to excuse me, deployment? Is it regularly tested with every iteration? What kind of testing does it go through? So I think AppSec has moved more to a testing paradigm, and thankfully a lot of that pre-deployment than traditional security. We're going to try to stop the bad guys from getting in here.
Right. And I totally agree. And that's certainly what I hear when I talk to people. It's about reducing risk. It's about fixing things that you're finding. And I like that. That is certainly a valid point. But the way I think about this is we are not yet left enough. So security is moving left, but I don't think it's as left as it needs to be. And the purpose of this, I'm going to build up to what I think the actual goal of an application security program should be. Now let's do this based upon cost. Start with that. And if we look at, and this is the traditional cost curve of a vulnerability, a bug in your software, where you find it and how much it costs to fix it when you find it. So going to the very earliest stages of requirements to the very latest stages of it's in the customer's hands, it's an exponential increase in the cost to actually fix a bug that you find. Now, that translates very well to security as well. And if we take a look at now when we test, so application security testing, for the most part, except for those DevOps teams that say they're in the performing category, is done at the end. I've got a release candidate. I'm ready to go. How's it working now? And what you'll find is that this metaphor works great for this. So here's a jet engine, tens of thousands of person hours to build, hundreds of thousands of dollars of parts with hundreds of thousands of dollars of value once you add the parts and the people labor into this to create this jet engine. Now I'm going to go do that. I'm going to throw it into a test stand. I'm going to throttle the engine up. And what typically happens if we equate this to software is that engine blows up. And the reason it blows up in this particular case, if we look on the left here, all these little fins that go into this jet engine, one of those fins has a crack in them, or maybe many of them have a crack in them. Maybe I got a bad batch of parts. Now, the question in DevOps is all about feedback loops. It's all about when could I have found this problem? Now, we do this with our software. We write software, and we test it at the end, and then we found out that a problem that we created on day one is now catastrophic. Well, if we had found it on day one, it would have been cheaper to fix, and it wouldn't have led to all of the additional man hours or person hours that went into building this engine and building this value for us to then have to either tear it apart or throw it away. Or the other metaphor I use is knitting. So if I drop a stitch at the very early stages and then I knit the whole sweater, I have to go all the way back. I have to unknit it and reknit it. That's the same kind of thing with this. I have to tear the engine apart to go find those fins, replace them, and then put the whole thing back together. It's incredibly wasteful. So we are hitting security at the worst part of that cost curve. Now, the other problem is we're not invited to the table. Traditionally in Agile and even in DevOps in some places, security is on the outside. We're kind of rubbing on the windows looking in saying, hey, I don't know. I don't understand this process, first of all. And even though I might understand it, I'm not invited to talk to you guys until you're done, which means I'm fighting for budget. So we end up in this problem where the security team finds 100 vulnerabilities. And they go to the team and they say, hey, I got 40 vulnerabilities. So we've already knocked it back. I need you guys to fix 40. Team says, hey, we're going to release next week. We can't do that. Can we just fix the most important things? What are the things that will make you go away, essentially? So maybe you get 5 of them out of the 40, out of the 100. So it's not a good practice. You uncover all of this risk at the very worst time when everyone thinks they're finished and are ready to push away from the table. So, what can we do about that? So let's take a look at a typical developer. Now, let's say that this developer, every time they sit down, they write at some proportion a flaw, a bug. Now, this could be security or it could be a quality bug. So I sit down, I develop for some period of time, and then I have to find the bugs. I have to track them. So that's a triage process, right? So we have now a room full of people that are talking about these bugs. Then I have to give it to someone to fix. Hopefully it's the same person that wrote it because that's the most expeditious method typically. Then I have to retest it. So if you take a look at that development time and then the actual cost of that development time by adding on all of the things that we find, it's wasteful. Now, in quality, in functional quality, it's not as easy to say, hey, I could have done it right the first time, right? We do a lot of test-driven development to prove that it works when we get to that stage. In security, it's a very different world. in a lot of places, like if you look at the OWASP top 10, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, there are choices. If I write it one way, it's secure. If I write it the other way, it's insecure. It doesn't matter what the function is or what that query is supposed to do. If I use a parameterized query, I'm not susceptible to SQL injection. If I concatenate strings, I am. So I can actually train developers not to write them in the first place. So let's say I could do that for some portion of the flaws that they typically write, SQL injection, for instance. So now, if I've got this developer that's trained, they develop code, and then they develop more code, and they don't create the problems in the first place. You can train them to have it come out of their fingers secure in a lot of these cases. Now, that's not to say that there aren't errors that you would find later on with pen testing or dynamic analysis. There are problems that you can create that you can't see easily with some of the analysis technologies, but that's okay. There's a huge part of the problem that we can fix today. So what I'll ask now is, and what I'll assert is, the real goal of an application security program should be to create secure developers. If I can teach them to write the code correctly the first time, I gain velocity. I've now done away with the find, track, fix, retest cycle of that development for certain categories of flaws, which, by the way, are extremely prevalent and easy to fix and easy to prevent. So my thinking now is, as far left as you can get, is I got to train them. I have to teach them how to do it right the first time. And if I do that, I become a net positive to the company because the developers are actually moving faster, presuming that they're going to have to fix those things that you're finding. So that brings us to our second poll question.
And here we go. Have you read The Phoenix Project, Gene Kim's fantastic novel on DevOps? Never heard of it, have bought it, but not read it. Have read it, and have read it and loved it. It's a fairly easy one, especially if you guys have read Phoenix Project. If you can give us your answer in 5, 4, 3. Come on, guys, a few more votes here. 2, 1, and let's see, what do we get? 50% of you have never heard of the Phoenix Project.
Wow.
That's interesting, Pete.
So, yeah, so for anyone that answered, I've never heard of it. It's not a textbook. It's an extremely easy read. You could do it over a weekend. It's the story of a fictitious company and their journey to understand the principles of DevOps, which is what the rest of this talk is going to be based on. Put it on your reading list. It's inexpensive. There's actually now just released, I think it was last week, Beyond the Phoenix Project, which is an audio series between Gene Kim and John Willis. I'm halfway through it now. It's about 8 hours worth of material. Incredibly valuable, where they talk about the very beginnings, the way that this was created, where this methodology came from. So the Toyota production system and Deming and Goldratt and the goal. The foundations of this go back to manufacturing and go back decades. So this is extremely valuable for you to understand where it came from, because you understand where that value can come from. So if you haven't read it, please go get it and read it.
Yep.
Okay. So when I talk to people about DevOps, if they haven't read the goal or they haven't really delved into, the kind of culture, like I said, at Amazon, you write it, you run it. The important part of that is getting the learning, is understanding and getting feedback. So DevOps teams, typically, they'll say, let me introduce you to my DevOps person or my DevOps team. And what they mean is the people that write automation, that deploy the software, and then they monitor it. That's interesting, but where does a developer and a quality person get that benefit of the feedback of deploying the application and operating it and monitoring it in our production environments? It has to be to get the full value. So you can do it without it, but you will not see the full value. You have to have the team responsible for every aspect of it. If it breaks in production, it's their problem. They got to go fix it. Now, that's not to say you don't have traditional operations teams, because if you think about the world of software today, it's not one big monolithic application. it's hundreds of microservices written by dozens of teams, so no one person can know the whole system or see everything. That's where your traditional operations team would look over the entire portfolio to see whether the production environment is working well. But for the individual components that they're shipping, absolutely they should be part of that system. And the same thing goes with security. As we talked about in the metaphor with the jet engine, people test at the end. And that's a terrible place. And that's the only place that they think about security. If you change your goal to be, I want to create secure developers, then what we get is the ability to think about security at all phases. So that way we're doing it at the earliest time when it's cheapest and easiest to make changes. So now we get to my strategy. And this strategy is, in the Phoenix project, there's something called the 3 ways. And the 3 ways talk about how to get the full value out of your, in this case, development cycles. So the first one is systems thinking, or Gene Kim now calls this flow. From the time that you thought about something till the time it gets into a customer's hands, what are all the things that need to happen to it in this value chain from point A to point B? And in this case, this is now what I'm going to call the 3 ways of DevSecOps, because we need to have a focus on security at this point. So between development and our operations and our customer, security has to be part of that conversation. It has to be part of the thinking of the value of the software. It gets built with security in mind. To do that, the first thing we have to have is relationships. And this is something that is most often missing. This is the first step to failure. If you do not know the people in your security organization, or if you're in security and you don't know the people in your development organization, then it's us versus them. I can say it's those security people, or it's those dang developers. They keep doing it wrong. But if we start to put names with faces, if we start to sit down and talk about our goals from the company perspective, then we can start to see that our goals are typically misaligned. So in the first phases of DevOps, you look from the Agile revolution to the DevOps revolution. One of the things that made that occur was the fact that those Agile teams were trying to ship software really, really quickly. So lots of change all the time. And the operations people sitting in those in enclosed environments are made and paid to keep things smooth, which means the thing that's going to cause the ripple in the lake is any change. So you throw a pebble in there, no matter how small, it's going to cause ripples. So they don't want change. Their goals are misaligned. And once we went to DevOps, we saw that alignment start to take shape where they started to move in the same direction. And that leads me to the next one. And this is, without a doubt, the number one thing that will cause your application security programs to fail. If developers don't feel that they're accountable for the security of their software, and that's not, a stick, I'm going to hold you accountable. It's, I am responsible. If it doesn't work, it's on me. If it's not secure, it's on me. This level of accountability is critical to actually getting progress to be made. You can't go in and convince people that they need to do it. It needs to be baked into their yearly goals. If you're not measuring them on software security, and it's not part of their goals, then why do you think that they don't do it? Because they're being measured on other things. That's not the thing that my company tells me is important. It's not the thing that my boss tells me is important. You have to change that aspect of the company culture, that they have to be accountable. So the second way is now to take that value stream and amplify feedback loops from each part of that value chain. And the key to this is measurement. So let's talk about this in the metaphor of blood pressure. If I go to the doctor once a year and they take my blood pressure, they say, hey, you have high blood pressure. Well, the only thing that you know, because there's approximately 365 days between those readings, is that once a year I have high blood pressure. Am I getting better? Am I getting worse? Do I actually have high blood pressure? Or is it just on that particular day that maybe I'm nervous to go to the doctor's office? Maybe, that's a stressful environment for me, so my blood pressure goes up. Maybe I always fight with my spouse on the way out the door, on the way to the doctor. Whatever it is, you don't really know anything about it. So until you put measurements in place at a frequency that allows you to see change, Am I getting better or am I getting worse? So if we think about that blood pressure, if I change that from once a year to once a month to once a week to maybe even once a day, I will now see whether or not I actually have high blood pressure or whether it's some anomaly of the time of year or what have you. So it's incredibly important for you to take a look at that and use measurement as what's going to motivate and move the needle on the rest of these slides. So the next one is, what are we going to measure and where are we going to measure it? And there are a number of things that Veracode has innovated around not only that process of thinking about when and where to apply security, but also the tooling that does this. So the first one here is you look at the developer box, is the developer picks up their work, they build and test. Now, because we have this culture of accountability, the developer knows that before they check in, they have to run security tests. And the incredibly important part here is I want to tell you that the after, which is the CI phase, which we'll talk about in a second, and the before, should be an open book test. If you expect something of them, there must be clarity on what it is, and you must give them the tooling to go and measure it. So now I'm going to do a couple of things here behind my check-in. One is something we call green light. So think of this as kind of the security spell checker. In 3 to 5 seconds on the code that you just wrote, I can tell you whether or not you have any security vulnerabilities in that code. So the feedback loop, right, that amplifying feedback is incredibly close to when you wrote it. And now I can use this as almost like an educational scan. Oh, I just wrote something. That's broken. Let me go fix it. The next stage is sandbox, where I take a look in context of the entire application. Again, now this box 3B is going to be our static analysis and our CI phase, right? It's the open book test. For everything I'm about to check in, am I creating any new vulnerabilities inside of the source code base? So after the check-in, we're going to bring up our CI service. So this is continuous integration. These are the static tests that we've been running for decades. Think of this as lint or code complexity or, what have you, code coverage of your unit tests. I'm going to run a bunch of tests. And inside of that, I'm going to run those traditional tests. And I'm also going to run static analysis. And that static analysis is going to tell me whether or not they followed the process. So 3A and 3B should be green, which means that 6 should be green. And if 6 turns out to have vulnerabilities that you did not want in the application and you were clear on them, that means that they did not do steps 3A and 3B. Now you have a choice of synchronizing back to backlog and essentially what we call breaking the build, where we say, hey, not good enough. This is not the standard that we hold ourselves to. So we're going to break the build and you've got to go back and fix it. Or we can move on if they've passed those tests. So the shift left in this case is taking things that were typically done in the middle, right? I do it based upon some release candidate, and I shift this into the development block and do it very early and as close to the time when I'm writing that code as possible. Now let's presume we have a high functioning team. They hold themselves to a high standard. They are accountable for the security of their software. So we pass the CI tests. Now we go on to the CD phase, the continuous delivery or the continuous deployment. We're going to move it into running environments now. And in this phase, we're going to run some things that you can't run via static analysis. So static analysis and unit tests and those kind of things can be run without running software. The software doesn't have to actually function for you to be able to run those tests. In the CD case, it does. I move it into my QA environment, my staging environment, eventually into my production environment, and I'm going to run some more tests on it. In these cases, we're going to run dynamic analysis because it's an operating piece of software. I can now take a look at some of this stuff from a dynamic point of view. I'm going to run my regression testing. Are the things that I'm about to do and about to change going to break the rest of the environment? And those are critical to getting you into your production environment. So the key here is to have tests that you trust, to have clarity on what you expect, and be able to shift that conversation left. Okay, now that we have data, right? So this whole process creates data. Awesome. I love data. I'm a developer. I absolutely love data. So now I can take that and apply that to training. Remember I said the goal for me for an application security program is to create secure developers. Now I have data that says what are the things that they struggle with. So we come to them as partners, right? We don't beat them with a stick saying you did it wrong. We say, hey, I see that you're struggling with SQL injection, cross-site script, whatever the case may be. I see these things in the data. Let me buy you lunch. So I'm going to fill a room with pizza. I'm going to fill it with developers, and I'm going to talk to you for 1 hour about one thing. That's the only thing I want to do right now. I'm going to talk to you about this one aspect, the one thing that we struggle with the most. And then because I have these measurements occurring, I'm going to see whether or not that's effective. What I should see is the incidence rate, the new vulnerabilities of that type being created should go down over time based upon the training that I've given you, if I've done it well. If I don't see that deflection in the curve, that means that I did it wrong and I have to go back at it again, or I didn't have the right people in the room, or what have you. This leads to the next set of questions about why didn't it do the thing that I expected. So we, posit the fact that we train them, they will get better. If that didn't happen, then why? So we use this to build that training over time and move farther left. The next thing for the practitioner, so for the security people in the audience, you can't be oblivious to how software is made today. It's moving too fast. It does change over time. So you see we've gone from Waterfall to Agile to DevOps. There'll be something after that. I don't know what it is yet, or else I'd be writing a book about it. You need to understand the process. So buying the Phoenix project and reading it, talking to your development teams and understanding and seeing how the sausage is made is critical for you to understand whether or not you're fitting into their process. So all the things before around testing in these phases, there are some critical aspects that say, do you fit or not? So the static analysis that happens in box 6 here, if that takes 2 weeks, that's too long for this kind of process. You're going to get kicked out of the room and they're going to say, you know what? We can't afford that. We're moving too fast. So you have to think about the kinds of tools that you're buying and the kinds of requirements that you're putting on them to see whether or not you're going to fit their process. Next thing is helping them fix what they find. So we generate something called the State of Software Security Report every year. And in that report, we take a look at correlations between some of the features and functions or some of the process that we've put in place and whether or not it has an impact on the final result, which is the security of the application. So again, back to that goal, if I have secure developers, I get secure outcomes. So what are the things that cause more secure outcomes? One of them is this idea of consultation. If we can let them talk to an expert on security and coding to say, here's how you would fix this type of vulnerability, they are almost 90% faster than the people that don't have access to this. And this goes to training as well. So as we put training in front of them, and in this case, it could be something as easy as e-learning. So again, another innovation is we tie results to e-learning courses to help them understand the things that they're finding. So if they're not taking this next step to consultation, at least they have some data in front of them. So we've innovated and linked those things and created even finer point courses, what we call AppSec tutorials. And those AppSec tutorials actually help them be 20% faster. So within 10 minutes, I can tell them everything they need to know about a SQL injection for them to be able to fix that at the point that they're finding it. So that's another area of value that we find in this State of Software Security Report. So helping them fix what they find is incredibly important. It's probably the thing that tips the scales the most. Again, almost 90% better by providing them access to this. So the third way, once we've increased the feedback and amplified that feedback, is to experiment, is to try to figure out, can we get better? DevOps is all about getting better continuously. Anytime I find something, I look at it and say, could I do that better? Will that help me? And then I try it. I have some expectations on what I'm going to see in my results. If I don't see it, then I can go back to the drawing board. One of the most valuable ways of doing this, especially when you look at the ratio of developers to security personnel, especially those that are just responsible for application security, you're talking 100, 200, 500 to 1 of developers to security. Now, in a lot of InfoSec conferences now, you hear people talk about this idea of a security champions program. In this program, you train parts of your development team. So think about, I have 10 teams that build software for me. I'm going to get 2 people from each of those teams, and I'm going to give them some advanced security training. Now, the key aspect to this is they need to be influential and they need to want to do this. So we want volunteers. Voluntold might be okay, but what we want is people on each of those teams to be there and be present for the conversations that happen around building software. So security conversations, software conversations happen all the time. Security conversations rarely happen. By giving people the talent and information that they need to provide that knowledge in those contexts, we've now upped our security understanding, right? So we can do better at it. We're more mature as an organization. And they know that there are some places where they kind of get over their skis and they know to come to us. They come to the security people and say, hey, we just did this new thing. I'm not really sure about it. Can you help me? Can you help me understand this? Can you come talk to the team about this? So it allows them to do about 80% of the work. And then for you to come in and provide that critical 20% of the security expertise that's needed. And in most cases, again, the security champions can do that work. Okay, so question number 3, I'm incredibly interested in the results of this one. If you guys could take to think about this, has this presentation changed the way you think about application security, about where it belongs, about what the goal is, about how to go after it? Because the ways that we're doing today don't work. So this is my presumption on what I think is the best approach to this. So I'm really interested in seeing what your feedback is on this.
Fair enough. Okay, folks, this one probably think you need to noggin on it a little bit before you give your answer. But we hope that this is, if it hasn't changed your perspective, at least it's giving you another perspective to consider. And really, that's all we can do. But why don't we get your answers in here in just another couple minutes? So please take a moment and vote. Great. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, survey.
How'd we do? How'd I do? This is my report card.
A little bit. I might try some of this. Is at 62%, Pete, and that's fantastic.
Awesome. That is
34%
excellent.
34% say I'm converted.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for your feedback, guys. That's incredibly useful. What do you think of those results, Alan?
I think those are great. You know, a fellow named Hugh in our audience, he wanted one though that said, "Hey, I already kind of thought that. I already agreed, but I learned some more today."
Excellent.
Which is also a good one.
Yes.
All right, back to slides, Pete.
Yes, sir. All right. So wrapping up at this point, and I'm excited to take some questions after this. DevOps is coming. If it's not there already in your organization, you're going to get there. So almost 50% that said they haven't heard of the Phoenix Project, go out and get it, learn about it. You could be a leader in this effort. You can lead the way for your company and become that expert that can help transform your company from where it is today to a much better place. Rethink the goals of your application security program. You can get secure outcomes.
Excuse me. I don't
Yes.
think we're getting your slides up here.
Oh. Okay.
Poll is closed, yeah.
They're closed. Sorry, guys. Working on it.
Okay.
All right, Pete, there we go.
Okay. So again, DevOps is inevitable. Become the leader, become the expert, be the one that leads your company through this. Rethink the goal of your application security program. If you're either a developer or a development leader or someone in the security organization, you can get to secure outcomes, but that shouldn't be the goal because that just keeps the waste in the system. Train your developers to write it right the first time, and then you'll be able to go faster. And you'll be able to get up higher levels of the maturity curve than you can today. The key to this is relationships. If people don't feel like they're responsible for the software that they write from a security point of view, then they're not going to do the work. So you have to change the culture of your company to say security is everyone's job, not just security. And come see us at RSA. Like I said, we have a lot of innovations around Greenlight, around how we think about building programs, the fact that we put services around our technology. We don't just find things. Any of the security tools on the market today can find vulnerabilities. But what we say is we can find them at a better rate and we can help you fix them. and not many companies on the planet can say that. Our customers fix more than 70% of the vulnerabilities that we find, and that's because of the programmatic approach that we take to security. So at this point, I am happy to take some questions.
All right, Pete, thank you very much. Before we get to questions, I'm going to jump in here with a few things. Number one, in terms of RSA, if you are attending RSA, Monday of RSA week, which kicks off, the full week of RSA activities, we're actually putting on and by we, I mean DevOps.com. Veracode is one of our core sponsors. We're putting on a full day of DevSecOps at the Moscone Center. As long as you're registered for RSA, you can come use your RSA badge. We've got some great topics and speakers lined up. We have reports. The Veracode folks will be there. It'll be a really fun, great day to learn and share with the community for DevSecOps. So please do that. For those of you who are considering maybe buying the Phoenix project or looking into it, we often give away copies here at DevOps.com, and I think we're working on a virtual DevOps conference called the DevOps Experience, which will take place this August. And again, CA and Veracode will be involved in that. And we'll be giving away a bunch of DevOps Handbook and Phoenix projects to people who register, either in hardcover or Kindle audio versions. So that might be a great way to win a copy. Now, Pete, to your point about Gene Kim's 3 ways in the Phoenix project, I think it's important that we let people know that if you go read the Phoenix project, these 3 ways are actually not dissimilar to the 3 ways of the goal, right?
Absolutely.
Which is a book that the Phoenix project is based on. However, what you may not get, folks, is what Pete's done here for you today, which is a great job of connecting the dots between these 3 ways of DevOps, right? And bringing that home to concrete things we do in DevSecOps that fulfill, right, that charter. So Pete, nice job in connecting those. I don't want to give people a false sense of hope that, that it's going to be laid out that well in the Phoenix project. The Phoenix project is not DevSecOps based per se, and it's not laid out here as well as Pete's done for you. So I would get the Phoenix project, but I download a copy of Pete's slides too, which will be available along with the recording of this webinar. Fair enough?
Sounds great.
Okay, so Pete, a couple questions from the audience. First one from Zachariah is it wise to say, or is it correct to say a DevOps profile, or do we just say a DevOps culture?
So if you go look around at the literature and you go find, so I'd urge you to go search for someone called Nathan Harvey. He works for Chef currently, and the way that he talks about DevOps is it's not about tools, it's about culture. So I really like the cultural aspect. It's about changing your entire organization as well. So one of the things that gets lost in this DevOps thing is that we think about the development organization, and we think about Dev and Ops being together, and we think about maybe adding security into there. But what's missing is what happens with sales, what happens with marketing, what happens with support. So let's say your team can release software once an hour. Well, what happens when something goes wrong and they call support and support's never heard of the feature? Because you haven't changed the way that you talk to them about the way the software is released. Are you training them more frequently now? Are they able to keep up with the level of change that you have? Are people in your sales organization, your marketing organization, talking about things that have already been released as if they were futures? Hey, we're going to have this great feature come out. And it's like, well, no, that was shipped last week. So you have to change the way you think about your entire organization as you start to move your software supply chain and move your software faster to customers.
Sure. And look, Pete, frankly, I struggle with this, right? When I speak to so many organizations that are undergoing DevOps transformations, and what do we say? We could say, well, they're undergoing a DevOps transformation, or they've adopted a DevOps culture, Or I've heard things like using DevOps patterns, right?
Right.
Or processes or best practices. Just don't call them late for dinner. But in all kidding aside, they're trying to adopt DevOps, and that's the key. What we call it, a culture, a profile, a pattern. The thing is that we're trying to make DevOps work, and
Yeah,
that's
and I think the critical thing here is, as was pointed out correctly in Soil and Green, is it's people. You can't do this without people, and people resist change if they don't understand the reasons behind it. So the reason I tend to lean on culture a lot is because your DevOps and your security problems are a people problem. It's Soil and Green. It's
yep.
people.
Extra credit for the Soil and Green reference, Pete. Okay, next question comes from Scott. And is it safe to say that when DevSecOps is done right, it's more secure and offers less risk than, Dev silo, Sec silo, Ops silo?
Yeah, so the reason that it's more secure is you don't have that budget conflict, right? Because you shifted left to the idea of the responsibility of developers. You're giving them clear guidance on what you expect. They can do it sooner and they can do it better. So it doesn't go through these chains of I'm done, no, you're not. I'm done, no, you're not. You allow them to test that sooner. They can give you more accurate and better results the first time around and not have to go through those budgetary debates. So it is absolutely better to include security in the conversation. It would be like building a house without thinking about the floor plan, and then after you're done framing it, saying, "Oh, where's the bathroom go? Oh, I forgot to think about bathrooms." So going back and trying to wedge that into the floor plan is just going to make things a mess.
Yep. Next question is a good question for you, Pete, and that is, I'm a beginner. How do I become a DevSecOps profile kind of person?
Yeah, so the first step is to go read that Phoenix project. Now, as you look at this, you're going to start to expand. So I really am enjoying, and I don't know, Alan, if you've had a chance to listen to any of the Beyond DevOps, Beyond the Phoenix project podcasts. Have you had a chance to listen?
I've heard a little bit of them, not as much as you have, evidently, Pete.
Right. So they go into the very, very deepest recesses of where this movement came from. So if you want to be a practitioner from beginner, I would even say just start with Beyond the Phoenix project. They go into depth about Deming and the impact that he had in production and how that applies to software. They go into Goldratt and the goal that you alluded to before, Alan, and talk about why that is so pivotal, and why that changes the equation for how we think about writing software. It goes into the Toyota production system. It covers all of the basis for safety culture and the things that have combined from the outside world to the virtual world to make our software better and faster. So it's all about research, learning the things that you don't know, going and investigating and being curious is going to be the key to you becoming a practitioner.
Yep. And let me give you a little practical advice here as well. I think, reading voraciously on subject and luckily there is a lot there in addition to the Phoenix project and the new audio supplement that came out with Gene and John Willis. There are other books, articles, ebooks, etc. on DevSecOps. I think though, to really understand DevSecOps, you first have to have a good grounding in just DevOps itself, right? Which you're going to get from Phoenix Project and similar kinds of things. But you need to have somewhat of an understanding of what security and AppSec is about. I'm not saying you got to be an expert or a CISSP or anything, but you should know what the OWASP is and so forth. Like, some of the references around that, from the security world. And then I will tell you that there's also a lot of formal training out there. The DevOps Institute has a DevSecOps actually class and certification. In order to take that, though, you do need to test out on the DevOps Foundation. sort of 101 prerequisite. There are other DevSecOps types of classes out there. The other thing I always tell people the world over, we're really, really blessed in the DevOps world in that we have fantastic local meetup groups. Many, of the bigger tech areas or cities will have both a meetup group for just DevOps as well as a meetup group for DevSecOps. So take a look at where you are. Find your local meetup groups. Start networking with folks who are in these meetup groups, and they can give you local on-the-ground advice that I think you'll find it invaluable as well. Anyway.
And there are hundreds of local conferences too. You got the DevOps Days conferences that happen globally. So there's likely one that's within driving distance of you. So take a look at those. Go to those. Those are incredibly well run and valuable places to go to get not only people talking to you, but also talking with other practitioners. The conference is not all about presentation. There is a portion of that, and then the second half of the conference is all about sitting with each other and talking through problems and what have you done to address this and what have you seen when you've applied that. Those are what I find the most valuable parts of those conferences.
Yep, and I will also tell you that be on the lookout for a fork of DevOps Days called DevSecOps Days, which John Willis is actually spearheading, and they'll be coming to cities around the globe as well. So next, Pete, what would be, Benir asks, what would be the most important during the security monitoring process in DevOps? Code, test, or deploy? Because after it's too late, all that's left is crying. Well, it's not all that's left is crying. Even after it's deployed, something goes bad, you can still react, right? That's feedback
Correct.
loop. You're never done with your DevSecOps. Things are going to happen. And when they do, you want to be in a position to roll back, correct, respond. But that being said, Pete, code, test, or deploy?
So I like to start with code. So understand that as you roll out your AppSec program to projects that have never had application security applied to them, you're going to find out a whole bunch of stuff you wish you never knew. And by the way, all that stuff is living in your production environment today. So you're not going to be able to fix it overnight because you didn't get there overnight. It's going to be a process. So understanding the risk that you have today, I think, is super critical, especially as you get into this monitoring and production or taking a look at new CVEs, the vulnerabilities that get announced inside of open source software, in understanding whether or not you're vulnerable to that. So another aspect of the Veracode platform is this thing called software composition analysis, where we look at the open source components that you use and the known vulnerabilities against them because they are public. So when we talked about the Equifax breach earlier, that's something that could have been avoided through software composition analysis. They would have known that they were vulnerable and they would have been able to quickly jump to a newer, more secure version. Again, when we ship open source, we don't say it's vulnerability free. We said we don't know any vulnerabilities inside of it. So that allows you to bring that. So understanding where you are, monitoring for that, and understanding that this is going to be a process that you're going to go through. So I always like to start with the code.
Pete, time for one more question. And this one is, which tools do I have to look for a .NET project in terms of engaging security in the DevOps process?
Well, I'm going to put my vendor hat on. We have excellent tools in the .NET space to connect you into Visual Studio, into TFS, into VSTS, and bringing that whole feedback chain. Again, one of the things I didn't point out in my earlier slide was integration into your IDE, integration in your build system, integration into your bug tracking system. Make the security things look like bugs, because that's where they get their work and that's where you should have it. So we do an incredibly good job in .NET of filling in those gaps, including that software composition analysis.
So, but Pete, you left out, where can they go get that information?
Veracode.com.
All right, that's what I was looking for. Hey, that brings us right up on the top of the hour. Pete Chestna, another great job. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm sorry, I'm just off a red eye this morning, so I'm not my usual perky self, but I tried to add as little value where I could. But you did yeoman's work here, Pete. Great job.
Thank you,
I
sir.
think you actually opened some eyes today.
That's awesome. That's what we want.
Yep. Pete Chestna and our friends at CA Veracode, thank you very much for sponsoring today. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for the great interaction and questions, everyone. Hope to see you soon on another DevOps chat or DevOps webinar, as well as our DevOps chat. You can listen to those too. But this is Alan Shimel for DevOps.com. Have a great day.